Good evening, Dungeon Masters. I'm Baron Durop. One of the most perennial questions new Dungeon Masters ask is, how can I effectively balance my combat encounters? While there's nothing wrong with asking this question, the question's regular occurrence indicates a misunderstanding of game design, unfortunately taught to us by the video game industry. Of course, that doesn't mean this question isn't without merit. One of the first video games developed which used a dynamic difficulty scaling system, Midway's 1975 arcade release Gunfight, staged a matchup of gunslingers in a best-of-11 shootout contest. Every time a player was shot, they would respawn in the center of their play area and a new obstacle would be placed on screen to offer the respawned player additional cover. Later, Compile's 1986 release Xanac, a vertically scrolling space fighter shoot-'em-up, used AI to adjust the game's difficulty by throwing more or less enemies at the player depending on the player's rate of fire and speed in which they dispatched opponents. And tons of video games since then have employed systems to adjust a game's difficulty based on player performance and power level. Crash Bandicoot adjusted moving platform speed when players struggled with coordination. Homeworld's AI increased the number of enemy ships at the beginning of a mission based on prior game performance, and nearly all modern Bethesda games, including Fallout 4 and Skyrim, employ a monster difficulty scaling system that makes enemies stronger as the characters level up. And systems in video games like these, for better or for worse, have inadvertently taught dungeon masters that encounter balance is a goal worth striving for. Yet, despite this phenomenon, not all video games follow this trend. Fallout New Vegas places a pack of Deathclaw within 2 minutes walking of the player's starting location. Sure, players can try to navigate through the Deathclaw den, but unless the player truly knows what they're doing, their character's gonna wind up dead. Another example of these seemingly unbalanced encounters even happens in the original Dungeons & Dragons Baldur's Gate video game. The RPG classic places similarly difficult encounters nearly adjacent to the game's starting location and punishes all but the most experienced players who attempt to access the area. To drive the point here, this intentional lack of encounter balance is explicitly a design choice. Encounter difficulty used in this way shapes the narrative the players are guided through without the players ever realizing their choices are being manipulated by their encounter's difficulty. To return to tabletop D&D then, only when tools like challenge rating, encounter level, and the XP budget first started appearing in 3rd edition, and their appearance was only thanks to external pressure from modern video game design, did this concept of encounter balance really start to earworm the tabletop zeitgeist. To be clear, the concept of encounter balance as we understand it today was basically absent from D&D for the first 26 years of its various editions and publications, longer than 20% of this channel's viewer base having been alive. Challenge rating is inherently flawed because it only makes sense in the most narrow of circumstances. And by narrow circumstances, I mean a moderately lit, air-conditioned football stadium where monsters square off 30 feet from one another. The moment a simple tree, shrub, or boulder is placed on the battlefield, the scope of the combat changes. Monsters who are able to leverage this change in terrain suddenly have a distinct advantage. Adding a simple boulder means enemies with ranged attacks can shoot, run, and hide to exploit their stat block to the fullest extent possible. In detail, if goblins were run by a dungeon master to their full effect and used abilities like nimble escape to dive behind shrubs, their small size to squeeze under fallen logs, and focused fire their bows to dispatch the party, the Lost Mine of Phandelver's first encounter on the forest road would be a total party kill 100% of the time. And similar statements can be said for every other goblin encounter in the Lost Mine's first chapter. The only reason players don't complain about their encounter balance experience with the module is because most dungeon masters who run Lost Mines are still learning the rules themselves and aren't familiar enough yet with how goblins operate to use them to their full potential. Alternatively, a handful of giant wolf spiders against a 5th level party would obviously be squashed in less than a round of combat, but that same party scaling a vertical wall crawling with those same spiders would get totally wrecked. Wizards can't cast spells with somatic components when their hands are too busy holding onto the rock face, and the paladin can't tank anything when the spiders are able to move twice as fast as the characters and don't need to make a climbing check to do so. Issues with systems like challenge rating or any other combat difficulty measuring tool don't stop with creatures intelligently using terrain to their advantage. These systems measure a creature's combat difficulty based on only two things: their average durability and their average damage output. Measuring a creature's power level in this way is fine when discussing monsters designed for outright physical confrontation, but some monsters with a given skill set, like a coven of dryads for example, would never even consider a direct assault. Their combat ability comes from guile and glamour. A player making a single failed save against the dryad's glamour ability is all a character needs to be grotesquely dispatched. A single fey charm can separate a character from the party and have that character lay down on a blanket of moss for some relaxing meditation, all to be utterly eviscerated by the group of dryad shillelaghs as they attack with advantage. As this example demonstrates, monsters with non-confrontational abilities, especially illusions, charms, and battlefield control spells, punch way above their weight when these non-combat abilities are used to their fullest effect. Worse still, we can dogpile the challenge rating measuring system's shortcomings with the aforementioned terrain problem. Ask yourself, which is more deadly? A half a dozen strength-draining shadows in an air-conditioned football stadium, or those same shadows attacking the party on a rickety bridge over a freezing brook where falling into the water below causes a level of exhaustion every round the characters fail a constitution save and further require strength-based athletics checks just to swim out of? Do you really think the players are going to be concerned with the measly 9 necrotic damage the shadows deal each time the players land a hit? Probably not. Since we're talking about encounters, I'd like to mention this video's sponsor, Describe. Describe is a database filled with inspirational prompts to level up your encounter descriptions, sure, but it doesn't stop there. Take your combat encounters to the next level by getting inspiration from, or even by using, Describe's various encounter maps, detailed with inspirational prompts written by professional creative writers. If you ever need an interesting encounter location and are stuck for ideas, check the link below and use the coupon code Baron when you sign up to get 10% off. Now back to the video. So if the tools we've been provided are a poor indicator of a monster's combat effectiveness, how do we select monsters for an encounter and reliably use them without overwhelming our players or causing a TPK? Well, it's honestly much simpler than you might believe. Think through in what scenario would a monster be most effective given their skill set, and make sure a typical player character would survive at least one combat round in that situation. Next, ensure the party has a means of escape if things aren't going their way, and make it clear to the players that escape is an option. That's it. There's nothing wrong with throwing a challenge rating 5 cave giant at a level 2 party. When players are presented with obtuse challenges like this, the pressure pushes them to intelligently use terrain and their weird single-use magic items to their fullest advantage. These circumstances will likely surprise everyone at the table with how creative the players are, and thus how effective their characters can be. If your players express a negative knee-jerk reaction to the apparent danger you're putting them in, it's likely because they've been trained by the modern video game zeitgeist to believe combat encounters should always be approachable. But video games don't always do this, and neither should your own encounters. You can overcome these complaints by reinforcing to players that they can run away and come back to fight another day, just like characters who bump into that Deathclaw hive at the beginning of Fallout New Vegas. With all that said, encounters don't always have to be so threatening. An encounter much weaker than the players offers a roleplay exercise instead of the threat of combat. When players know they can obliterate a pair of kobolds who have separated from their troop, characters can use threats or intimidation to extract useful information from them. This information may foreshadow a larger, possibly imminent encounter with the main kobold troop, and further, that engagement with the troop would be certain death. And that example brings us to a third option for encounter design. There's still nothing wrong with presenting an encounter so powerful the characters would clearly die if they stood and fought. To do this fairly, however, Dungeon Masters must foreshadow this threat level very clearly, otherwise the resulting player deaths will feel like a cheap trick. Sometimes a monster's threat level is extremely obvious. A group of first level players would never challenge an adult green dragon in combat. They would absolutely try to smooth talk their way out of danger. However, if a monster's threat level isn't obtusely clear to the players, demonstrating that threat on a throwaway NPC NPC or a heavy durable object is a great way to reinforce the danger appropriately. Aboleths who easily eviscerate an elite royal guard and proceed to suck the brains out of their skull like some child's twist and drink beverage, or large krakens who splinter a nearby sailing boat in a single tentacle slap are all good examples of these power level demonstrations and openly encourage players to parlay or run away. In a nutshell, the modern understanding of encounter balance is a logical fallacy. More useful is ensuring you communicate threat level to your party effectively and provide methods for their escape if they need it, and encourage players to leverage the terrain, magic items, or social mechanics at their disposal to solve problems. If you'd like to help me make more content like this in the future, please consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a channel member. Thanks for watching, Dungeon Masters, and until next time, good night.